Okay, so we'll get started. I would like to welcome Dr. Shirali for this morning's talk and followed with question and answer session. He has been inspired by Krishnamurti's teachings and his deep uh, interest in exploring the teachings brought him to Krishnamurti schools. He joined Rishi Valley in 1983 and he was a principal there for many years until 2004. And now he is the director of the Sehadri Center near Pune. He also has a deep interest in mathematics education, and ancient Indian mathematics, and has authored several books for high school students. So I would like to welcome Shailesh to introduce the theme for today. And what we'll do is that at the end of it presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So you are welcome to post questions as we go along on the chat box. And I'll be posing the questions to him in brief when we get to that point. So welcome everyone, and let's hear Dr. Shailesh now.
Thank you very much, Guruvinder. And thank you very much to Valley School, to Sushma, Guruvinder and Murli for inviting me for this occasion, for this meeting. The theme that I have decided to talk about it's a long title. It says it's about identity, and the full title is Inward Richness and the Question of Identity. I could change it slightly and say Inward Richness and the Problem of Identity. And as you can guess from the title, this is very quickly going to get us into areas which would normally be part of political science or circles of that kind. So the early part of my presentation is going to be largely about, not largely, somewhat about those aspects of what identity has done in terms of its consequences at the global level and at the large level. And then I'm going to ask this question about inward richness. It's a phrase which Krishnaji has used several times in his talks, particularly with students. And it's very tricky to try to understand what this thing actually is. What actually does inward richness mean? And how does it come about? What is the source of it? And what does it have to do with identity? And of course, the most important thing is there a possibility of nurturing it, given that, Krishnaji was passionately interested in education. He set up so many schools, or other people in his name or as through his teachings. And I think it's very important to ask this question as to whether inward richness is there anything that we can do which will nurture such a quality? Because it has great importance if you start looking into it. Okay, so I'll open the presentation now, and we'll see how it goes. So please do, pitch in with your questions. Before I start, I'd like to just say that this topic is a very complex topic, and it's a difficult topic, not merely because of its consequences, but because of the very nature of inward richness and the nature of identity for each one of us. So please do raise questions, and we'll see where we can get with them. So I hope you can all see the screen. So I'm going to sort of intersperse between this presentation mode and talking directly. I'll close the presentation once in a while. Okay. So I've called it here the problem of identity rather than the question of identity. So first of all, I'm going to ask, why has identity become so important an issue in the world today? And I think if we look around the world, we'll easily see that it has become such a very a potent force that causes great violence, great movements, and great disruption. So that's why I've called it the specter of identity. And if you look at some of the consequences, fundamentalism, which is a huge force in the world today, nationalism, just as big a force, perhaps even bigger than fundamentalism, racial tensions, then the rising spiral of violence associated with all these, tremendous degree of intolerance. You'll find across the entire world today, the degree of intolerance is rising steadily, much more so than it was in earlier generations. And we see a steady breakdown in the democratic process because of all these. It's a direct consequence. And of course, ultimately, one consequence is war. Now, all these consequences that I've spelt out are at the large level, nations or big countries and so on. But there are other kinds also. There are also crises at the individual level. And we have to understand what identity means at that end. When you have the pervasive sense of alienation from the kind of work that you do, the kind of lifestyle that you live, and a feeling that life has just lost all meaning. You are just getting caught in a kind of treadmill and going round and round and round. So what do we do? If the common factor at the center of all these is this thing called identity, which is who am I? What am I? And why does this question matter so much? Why do we even need to ask this question? So first of all, the first question perhaps which occurs to us is identity an illusion? Is it a fiction? What is it? We have the sense of I, the sense of something in us, but is it something real or is it just some fictitious entity? And you'll find everywhere that psychologists give great importance to it. They say it is real. They say we need it, even whether it's real or not. Others, they may not be worried about whether it's real, but they say we actually need it. And I've asked, is that really the case? Because does identity serve any useful role in life? And we must know the truth about this in our own exploration, because the consequences are really enormous. You just look around the world today and see what's happening. So what is identity? The dictionary itself defines it this way: who a person is. So that means what am I? But it's interesting that they add this second part also to the sentence: the qualities of a person or group that make them different from others, something which distinguishes them from other people. So there is that comparative sense which is built into it, that I am different from you in some way. So they are including that in the very notion of identity. And then there is this word identification, which is related to identity. We are going to be having this interplay between these two words right through this talk: identity and identification, which are not exactly the same thing. So identification with a group, which is based on various factors. It could be based on nationality, on religion, on race, on ethnicity, on gender. Yeah, could I request the mics to be switched off, please? There's some sound coming. It could be based on race, on ethnicity, on gender. Now that's a huge factor, okay, gender. And now in recent times, identification based on sexual orientation, that also has become a huge factor in today's world, major factor. And then things like based on your profession or your particular talent or some particular interest that you have. But of course, the most significant of these are the first two: identification based on nationality and religion. The others, lesser so. Now, just to give you a sense of, just like I quoted to you what a psychologist said, here's what the political people say. Typical, for example, I've taken some extracts here from some documents about early America. So they say out here, a key to maintaining a democracy is establishing a national identity that unites all citizens into a single in-group. They claim this, that the democracy is not going to function unless you have this particular factor. So we must ask, is this really so? Because this is, again, it has profound consequences. Then somebody else said, the founders saw that national identity could not be built on traditional religious and tribal loyalties. Again, referring to early history of America. Citizens were to be united through patriotism and allegiance to a set of beliefs and core values. So you see the tremendous importance being given to this idea that you must all subscribe to a set of beliefs. There must be a compulsory togetherness in that. You subscribe to the same set of values and beliefs and so on. And it is summarized by this motto, which I believe used to be the motto in America in early generations: E pluribus unum. That is, out of many, one. And you see, it says a lot. And now let's look at our own country. You'll notice, if you look at the conversation going on, which is in fact going on at a higher and higher volume these days, it is assumed, it's almost like people are shouting this. There's a strong feeling that we need to create a national identity by appealing to our distant past. And what does that mean? Recalling our golden past. You go back to, say, the Gupta period of the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, where tremendous, marvelous things were happening in area of sciences and mathematics and so on. And the wonderful achievements of those days, really, they were actually, tremendous things were actually happening. There's no doubt about it. And then recalling what centuries of colonial rule and invasions have done to our culture, to our psyche, the combined effect of all that, or past, say, 600-700 years. Look at this typical, I just grabbed a screenshot from a newspaper. India's new Hindu, why he just cannot be ignored anymore. And look at that bottom line. The new Hindu in the country has learned not to be coy about his Hindu identity and instead be proud of it. So notice this, the emphasis on that word identity, that again and again it comes. And here are some other such things. Look at the title of this book, Looking for a Hindu Identity. Then a talk given by Dr. Subramaniam Swamy. India's identity is Hindu identity. And you see this picture out here, the kind of aggression that is being shown. But we are not the only culture which faces this. Look at these. Look at what's happening in the Islamic world. Look at these titles: Islamic identity and the struggle for justice, Muslim identity in a turbulent age, Muslim identity politics, the American Muslim identity. You see, so many people, so many cultures across the world are facing this strange question of who are we? And now the question to be asked is it to be answered in the same way that it is asked, who are we? And then somebody gives an answer that you are this, this, this. Or do we have to question, why do we have to ask such a question at all? Why does this question become so important in modern times that we need to have a national identity? So this is a very critical question. Again, some more examples of what psychologists say. If I have a strong sense of identity, by the way, now this is not just at the national identity, but it's also at my own individual level. So a psychologist says, if I have a strong sense of identity, I do not seek validity and approval from others. It helps me make decisions and exercise control in the way I conduct myself. It brings me comfort in times of stress. They are making strong claims here. If I have identity, then all this follows. And the second conclusion which follows from this is that I need to do this so that I do not feel stress, so that I can make decisions and so on. Then there is this word which often comes up, identity crisis, in which one begins to question one's place in the world. And one psychologist has described it as one of the most important conflicts that people face. That is, questioning one's place, meaning, what exactly am I? What am I doing here? What's my place? What's my role in the world? So if identity is being given so much emphasis, Now, the real question is, how do I get such an identity? Imagine that children in a school are told, you must have an identity because that is what the nation needs. That is what you need if you are to live successfully, if you are to live a life without stress and so on. But where does this identity come from? And then now I'm going to look at this word identity and identification, not just now, but it's going to come up also later in the talk. What's the connection between these two? Identity has a sense of something fixed, whereas identification is when you identify with something and there's a sort of action in it, some activity going on. So how do I identify myself? With my religion, we've already seen that, my nationality, my caste, my possessions, that also happens. Look, I have a Lamborghini, somebody may be boasting to everybody. So such a person is sort of measuring himself in terms of a possession. Or you may measure yourself in terms of your accomplishments. That is your core. That is what you use to stand out in the world. I have accomplished this, I have built this kind of whatever. Or you may identify with your family name, your talent. And of course, in the case of religion, there's a direct link with fundamentalism, as I mentioned earlier. And just as by the way, I've added out here, children often identify very strongly with parents, not just with parents, but even with the name of the family, the actual name. As a result, if some other child were to just twist that name a little bit, they get extremely upset. I'm sure you have noticed this in a school. They get so angry just by playing on the name. Now, this is a very important question. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask this question. Let me just break this, stop this for a moment. The question is, what exactly is identity? There is a body identity, right? There's a bodily identity. For example, if you were to sort of poke me with something and just keep poking me in sort of trying to annoy me, I will get annoyed because it hurts me, right? And it bothers me. It's like a violation of me. You step on my toe or something. And then there's the physical sense of self-protection. If we have ever been threatened in a life-threatening situation. The other day I actually experienced that. I was in such a situation and I could see the body gasping for breath and trying to recover its poise, come back again to life, so to speak. And so there is that kind of sense of self. There's also the sense of self in the sense that what is my true nature? Krishnaji, for example, often emphasized at the school level, children need to find out what they love to do. That's also a kind of selfhood, but not self in the sense of identification. But there's something, you're trying to find out something about yourself. So there is that connotation of the word identity. But there's also the other connotation, which is actually being referred to by people out here, which is that is you identify with something. Now that's where the difficulty comes, that we are not just talking about our own, our own inner nature, the way we think, the way we operate, but we are being encouraged to identify with something, some sort of an artificial creation. So there's a very big difference in finding out your true nature, finding out what you actually love to do, which is something, as I said, Krishnaji emphasized so much, and identifying with something outside, some creation, which then gives you, in the belief that it will give you a certain stability. So let me go back to the screen now. See, this has very fundamental implications. Sorry, there's something out here. I've called it a reality which is not real. Any method for creating an identity is artificial. It creates a reality that is not real, which doesn't actually exist. And we are very good at this. I gave a talk at the study center some weeks back, and when I pointed out some things that this author Yuval Harari had said, I'm going to just quote a couple of paragraphs from that. But for example, he has used this very interesting phrase called fictional reality. And he says, our unique trait is the ability to create and believe fiction. That is, we create a fiction and then it becomes so real to us that we believe it. It's all other animals use their communication system to describe what are things which are actual, real dangers, real sources of food or water, real things. But we use ours to create fictional realities, that is, things which don't actually exist. And why do we do that? Now, that's the crucial point. Why do we take all the trouble to create fictional realities? Maybe they are sometimes sources of convenience. So he has written further, fiction has enabled us to imagine things collectively. We weave myths such as creation stories and the nationalist myths of modern states. And these myths enable us to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. Now, some of these, what he calls myths, are useful actually. For example, money. Money itself is a myth, right? Just imagine a piece of paper, a rectangular piece of paper is worth enormous amount. You can go and buy a lot out of with that piece of paper. But it's just a meaning, it's just a symbol. And yet we have all agreed that it is a very important symbol. So that means through this collective agreement, something assumes great importance. So these fictions really have enormous power, immense. I mean, it not just the word immense needs to be sort of triply underlined. If you look at what these fictions have enabled us to do, you have things like the whole notion of nationality, the whole notion of us and them. We are, even in primitive tribes, we are this is our tribe, that is their tribe, us and them. And the whole way of distinguishing between one group and another group. And then through religion, whole notions like heaven, hell, and so on. All these are fictions, and yet they have such a powerful effect on our lives. And then money, the whole notion of a corporation, which is just a fiction, and yet corporations have become so real. The stock market, the whole notion of capitalism. And then, look at the French Revolution, whose battle cry was liberty, equality, fraternity. And then we the people. The moment you use a phrase like we the people, there's a certain fiction behind that. Or a word like freedom. Freedom is talked about so much, and it is given so much importance. For example, in the United States, they talk about the freedom to own arms, to bear arms. That is considered to be free, a freedom which cannot be taken away, or freedom of speech. These are all ideas, and yet we give them tremendous importance, and they acquire tremendous power. So you can see through this the tremendous power of words and symbols and the imagination. And so it is, I think, with identification. Identification is also a kind of fiction. And we must understand why this fiction has acquired so much significance in our lives. So here's a quote from Krishnaji. First, we invent the symbol. See how our minds work. The image in the church or in the temple or the letters in the mosque. And in worshipping that which we have created out of our thought, we derive strength. See what is happening. The symbol is not the actuality. The actuality may never exist, but the symbol satisfies and gives us vitality by looking at it, by thinking about it, being with it. Surely that which has been created by thought must be an illusion. So it's interesting, this quote from Krishnaji, it is exactly parallel to what Yuval Harari has pointed out. He has invented a different phrase, fictional reality. And here Krishnaji has pointed out how by inventing a symbol and then worshipping it And as the process that worship continues, it gradually seems to get imbued with a kind of aura, a kind of power, and it gives us a kind of a strength. So there's a kind of hypnotic effect that we get out of it. So I'm going to ask 3 questions in the remaining part of this presentation. First of all, how does identity form? What gives it its sustenance? How come it, what gives it life? What gives it strength? How does it survive? Second, what are the consequences of living under an illusion like identity? And why do these consequences come out? And third, what is our destiny from this? What do we want to make of our lives? And this is particularly vital living as we are in our own country, where the question of identity has become so, so loud. People are so caught up in this question of what is India? And this question needs to be addressed, whether we like it or not. We have to address this question in some way, because what are we going to, we have the children in our schools. What do we want them to grow up to be? What do we want to communicate to this? So this third question also is very important. So let's go into this. How does identity form? So now let me come back to that distinction between identity and identification. So there's a verbal trap out here. See, when you say identity, it sounds as though it is something fixed, some constant object. It's a fixed, concrete object. But actually, it is not that which is of so much consequence. It is the act of identification which we must examine, that we actually trying to identify with something. The later, as time progresses, that identification produces a kind of fixed object, which we call an identity. But so we have, if we really want to understand this process, we have to understand the process of identification, not the identity itself, which may be in fact a dead object. So identity itself may be an illusion, and we have to understand our own action, which is identification. So I'll just leave this as a question. What's the connection between these two? And I have pointed out here that it is obviously related to our deep need for stability, our deep need to belong to something, which is what the psychologists also have pointed out, and the nation builders have pointed out. And you look at, for example, there's this beautiful hymn, Abide with Me, which I'm sure many of us will be familiar with. Recently, it got into political controversy also. But there's a very beautiful passage in the middle of that particular hymn, where it says, "Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me." So look at the deep longing being expressed in these lines, the deep longing for stability, for something to hold on to. You live in a world where nothing is dependable. Everything that you hold on to shifts and moves and just crumbles to dust. And you're desperate to hold on to something which is not going to be lost, which is not going to slip away from your hands. And this you can see this in the mind praying for something which changest not, stay with me. There's something very beautiful about this line. So where does this need originate from? Obviously, deep down in us, there is a sense of insecurity. And the important thing is, we may not even be aware of this insecurity. Often, we have inside us a feeling of loneliness, a feeling of anxiety, a feeling of being unrelated, and we may not be aware of it. But we experience it as pain. We may experience it as restlessness. We may experience it as boredom. But there is that need for holding on to something. And the response, I think, is that we identify with something. We identify with a group or an ideology or a new religion which sounds very attractive, or a new cause, a new philosophy, a new group to hang out with. So you see how our minds play with this whole phenomenon. So clearly, if this is happening, it is telling us that deep within us, there is some emptiness within us. There's a kind of vacuum within us. It's as though, there's nothing inside us. Because if there was something solid inside us, we wouldn't be just sort of, blown about like leaves in the wind. That plea that we heard in that verse, that plea for stability, that longing for something to hold on to, it points to something. It's not just come out of nowhere. It's come out of that sense of emptiness. Some of you may have heard this one response to a question which Krishnaji asked at the beginning of one talk. He asks a very interesting, I can actually play that video for you later if there's time, if you wish. He asks, do questions need answers? And then he says, say for instance, I ask a question, I want to challenge or question the whole of civilization. And he makes a remarkable statement. He says, look at the culture of India, which is now something like 5,000 years old. And he makes a remarkable statement. It has vanished overnight. It's a culture which is just almost vanished in a period of a few years. And then he asks, is civilization just a coating? Is our culture just a coating? Is there nothing solid, something indestructible, incorruptible inside it? And you look at what's happening in our country today, you wonder what's happened to this. So we try to fill that emptiness by identifying with something, because you can't bear that emptiness. Or it need not be identifying with something. Sometimes it takes different forms. You may try to fill it with excitement, excitement of some activity, some high intense activity, or drugs, the excitement of taking drugs and experiencing all kinds of fantastic visions and so on. Or you pursue relationships. Anything that sort of gets you involved in activity. Or endless purchasing, just keep on purchasing things. Even war. Many people join war out of a feeling of boredom. Anything to take us away from ourselves. That's what we do when we are faced with that emptiness. There's something quite frightening about it. But unfortunately, these attempts are all futile. Trying to escape from oneself, well, it's one of the most difficult things. I think all of us would know that. You can't get away from yourself. It's like trying to get away from your shadow. It's impossible. Now, this is the question which is really important. Now, what has been written in that blue font, we have to all see that it is so. If we don't, we need to, challenge that statement. If the basic drive behind identification at the most profound level is that sense of inner emptiness, then should we not address that problem? Why is it that we jump so quickly to trying to find a solution for it, and that solution doesn't actually solve the problem? We just jump from one solution to another solution, and no solution works. Shouldn't we try to understand this emptiness itself? And in a way, it reminds us of that Sufi. I've not written that story out here, but I'm sure all of us are familiar with it. It's the story of the person who loses a key under a lamppost, and a passerby comes and says, what's happened? He says, I have lost a key. Where have you lost it? Oh, I've lost it somewhere there in that dark patch out there. Then he says, why are you looking here under the lamppost? He says, oh, there's plenty of light here, so I'm looking. It's much easier to look for something here. Now, that's this story, when you narrate it, sounds a bit ridiculous. You'll say, who would do such a thing like that? But actually, whole of humanity, it seems to be doing exactly that. Because you see, this question of inner emptiness, perhaps we find it so difficult to solve this problem.
You want to play with some friends?
Hello, sorry?
Check with them.
Sorry, yeah, I think there was some voice just now. If the real problem is that of inner emptiness, and we find it so difficult to solve that we are unable to even stay with that problem, then we seek some solution which actually doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually solve the problem at all. So you see, there's a certain tragedy in this, that we spend so much energy, so much of our time trying to find a solution, a fictitious solution to a real problem, which doesn't actually solve the problem at all. Not only does it not solve the problem, it creates more problems, as I'll show you in a minute. Now, just as by the way, I've got this in-between slide just to say identification may happen in other ways too. I may identify with something that I do, like I write a book, and then I identify with the book. So if you were to criticize the book which I've written, I get angry. I get furious with you. Or I start a movement, or I open a school, and then you tell me that the school is no good. I get angry. So I may invest my whole being in something that I do. I identify with something. And then another very interesting form of identification is through hatred. It's a sad story to identify yourself through hatred, but it can happen. That is, you hate somebody so much that itself becomes your identity. And this is again a fact of history. I think it actually happens in history. But there's an interesting folk law, you can say, that which you hate, you become. Anyway, I'll leave that. We are not here to discuss that particular thing. So now I'll bring this first question to a close. I've written out here, we have talked about the apparent I put in brackets, need for identification, and the need for security and stability, and the sense of security and stability that it brings. But we have not examined the consequences of identity. What does identity do? What happens to us when we start identifying with something? So this is the fallout. Does the desperate desire for identity have consequences? If so, are those consequences benign? Just, it's okay to have those consequences, they don't do any harm. Or is there a much grimmer side to them? And there really are consequences. Now, this is one very important point which one begins to understand as one studies Krishnaji's teachings, that identification is always with a part. It's with a fragment. There's no such thing as identification with the whole. I don't think psychologically it makes any sense to talk of identification with a whole. And this we could question, we could challenge this statement also. I would say it's an essential nature of identification, that you isolate, you take a particular part and you invest all your feeling, your emotion into that. Now, what happens when we identify with a part? Obviously, what happens is that we become inwardly separated from another part. We get separated from the other fragment. And this is something, what you see in this slide, Krishnaji has been at pains to point this out for decades, that it is a fundamental law that the moment you produce division, it's going to produce conflict. Division leads to conflict, inevitably. And if you begin to look at it, this statement very carefully, you begin to see that it is actually like a law of nature, almost like the law of gravity or something. Division leads to conflict. And once it's a law of nature, you can see that you're not going to be able to break such a law. To quote a line from the 10 Commandments, that film, One cannot break a natural law, but one can break oneself against the law. Rather a grim statement. If you just consider the human tragedies that identification have produced over the past, and the present. War, genocide, hate crimes. You look at what happened in India and Pakistan during the partition years of 1947-48. Enormous number of killings. You'll see what happened in the Balkans, Srebrenica in 1995. Large number of people massacred purely in the name of belonging to a particular religion. Look at what happened in Rwanda in 1994, where huge number of people belonging to one particular tribe, belonging to one particular tribe were massacred. So again, a massacre based solely on identity. Look at what happened in World War II, the Holocaust, the Jews, and now what's happening in Ukraine. The whole notion of nationalism. So you see different kinds of identity here. In some cases, it's religious identity, at least in the first two cases. In the case of Rwanda, it's a tribal identity. Again, in the case of the Holocaust, a religious identity or a racial identity. And Ukraine, a pure nationalistic identity. My country, my this, my that. And then in our own country, we see the caste violence around the notion, the identity of caste. The caste violence, the caste rapes, and the lynchings associated with religion. Terrible things are happening in our own country, all around this one single specter of identity. So it's almost beyond belief when you consider the scale of suffering, the scale of violence, the scale of sorrow associated with just this one single fiction. It's almost impossible to believe it, that a single fiction can be the cause of such a lot of suffering through history. Here are 3 quotes from Krishnaji. Identification, they're all we should listen to this very carefully. Identification is a thought process by which the mind safeguards and expands itself. See what is being pointed out. The mind safeguards itself and it expands itself by identifying with something larger. And then he says, identification puts an end to discovery, and it's another form of laziness. Why does it put an end to discovery? It's worth asking. In what way does identification bring an end to discovery? Because by identifying, we are in a way giving up our own authenticity. We are just taking on somebody else's conclusions, somebody else's observations. We are sort of absorbing ourselves, submerging ourselves into some kind of a group. So in a way, your own being is gone. And then the last statement, identification is vicarious experience. That means experience that has been experienced by somebody else. And you, through some mental trick, begin to experience with something which somebody else has experienced by sort of imagining that you're that person. So somebody else has won a match, you feel pride, though you had absolutely nothing to do with that match. Some country achieves a military victory, you feel pride, though you have absolutely no connection with it. So this vicarious experience is a very crucial observation that Krishnaji has made out here. Then another quote, what do we mean by identification? You identify yourself with your country. When you do that, what happens? You immediately enclose yourself through that identification with a particular group. When you call yourself a Hindu, you have identified yourself with particular beliefs, traditions, hopes, ideas. And that very identification isolates you. So identification is separative, is a deteriorating factor in life. That is a fact. That is the truth of it, whether you like it or not. To me, the key statements in this passage, which we need to explore, are, well, it's fairly clear that identification is going to isolate you and is going to separate you, because you are sort of putting a boundary around yourself. But why should identification be a deteriorating factor in life? That's very important to understand. In what way does identification bring about deterioration of our brain and of our connection with life itself? This is a very important observation, I think, which Krishnaji has made out here. Then some more quotes. All human beings want security. We seek security in illusions. That's that whole business of fictional reality, which I mentioned earlier. We seek security in illusions. My nation, my God, the universal God that I believe in. But you don't believe in that. And so there is conflict between us. So you see how conflict breeds conflict, belief breeds conflict. And then identification is a refuge. Well, that's fairly clear. It's a refuge against the instability that we see around us. A refuge needs protection, and that which is protected is soon destroyed. Now, this is a very interesting statement being made here. A refuge needs protection, and that which is protected is soon destroyed. Identification brings destruction upon itself, and hence the constant conflict between various identifications. Look at there's great power in this statement out here. That which is protected is soon destroyed. There's so much we have to explore in all this. So you see, identification needs sustenance and reassurance. And as I've written out here, through identification, we vicariously experience pride. And how do we do that? We live on others' achievements and others' experiences. For example, I don't know if you have noticed, that points to what I've said in the early part of the presentation about our own idea of India. Have you noticed how often people they talk about the great achievements of Indian mathematicians and scientists of 1,000 years back? And we say it with such pride. So we are living on that achievement. We vicariously experience pride that some Indian mathematicians, say the Kerala group of mathematicians of the 14th century, what beautiful things they did. Indeed, they did beautiful things. But for me to start experiencing pride on that, through that, is something which I need to question. But it is happening sort of in an unquestioning manner. I've just written in brackets out here, vicarious experience can have value, but only if the intention is to learn something. We'll go into that later. It doesn't have a bearing on our topic right now. But identification needs sustenance, because by being isolated, you need to be sustained through some kind of a force. And therefore we build echo chambers. We build little small groups in which we keep hearing the same thing again and again from everybody around us. So we form groups on Twitter, we form groups on Facebook, and we keep hearing this, and those are kind of self-sustaining phenomena. So does this not point to a deep inner emptiness within us, that we are doing all this? There's something, of a great sadness in this, that we are so afraid of being nothing. And just as by the way, I also have listed a few quotes out here just to show that this problem, which we may think is a 20th or 21st century problem, is not at all so. It has been around for a very long time. Here's a quote from Henry David Thoreau. "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." I find this statement very scary. Just that almost 150 years back, a writer could write such a line, that the mass of people lead lives of quiet desperation. There's a quiet despair in us, which we may not express, we may not write about it, and yet it's there in us. Then one statement which Krishnaji has got in his book, you'll find The Only Revolution, as part of a conversation which he's having with somebody. The sadness of life is this, the emptiness that we try to fill with every conceivable trick of the mind. This is a conversation with a person who is very rich, and he's like a collector with vast number of objects in his house. And this poet T.S. Eliot, he has used this phrase, the hollow men. This is in the post-World War I phase, when there's a complete despair about the kind of war which had taken place. And he uses this word, which itself is a rather frightening word, the hollow men, the stuffed men. You see, all this is pointing to something, a common phenomenon, that in our civilization, we have nothing in us. We are somehow empty people. So everywhere in the world, we are turning out empty shells in our educational institution. We have become empty shells with nothing original in us. And perhaps that is what Krishnaji means when he repeatedly uses the phrase second-hand human being. That's what we have become, second-hand human beings, and we are perpetuating that through our education system. So why have we allowed such a thing to happen, this extraordinary inner emptiness? We have become second-hand human beings, quoting and following others. Psychologists, philosophers, gurus, and saints have told us what to do and think. We never wipe the slate clean so that our brains are fresh. We never read the story of ourselves. That story of ourselves is the story of the rest of mankind. We never read that book. You cannot possibly learn sitting at the feet of another, nor can you follow another. But you have to observe the extraordinary content of consciousness, what man is, why he behaves in this unreasonable way without a sense of beauty, love, or compassion. So this last part of our presentation, I'll come. What is our destiny? Do we want to continue in this path? Is there any other way forward? Is, this whole business of clinging to an identity? To me, this is the most important question. It is the whole question of the idea of our country. What do we want this country to be? What do we want? Because it's going through such agony, you can say. And also it's not just at the national world level, it's also what do we want to do with our lives? Again, Krishnaji, we as human beings are the rest of the world, and the world is us. And so our responsibility is global, not just for my family, for one's children. Those are important, but we are also responsible for the whole of mankind because we are mankind. But our beliefs, our ideals, our cultures, our experience divide each one of us. We are Catholic, Protestant, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, or following the latest guru. That is what is breaking us up, our nationalities, our insular attitudes. And this attitude brings about fragmentation in our lives. And where there is fragmentation, there must be conflict between various fragments of which you are made up. So from ancient times, I think, people have asked, human beings have asked, if there is something more to life than just living. Just living means just solving the day-to-day problems of life, of getting food, getting water, building your shelter, just solving the problems, day-to-day problems. Something beyond problem solving, something which endures, something which survives. And I think probably we have asked this question ever since we became aware that we die. We become aware of death. And it's very interesting that the anthropologists have found that awareness of death is a very ancient thing. Early human beings, as long back as say 50,000 years back, were aware that there is such a thing as death. They gave importance to burials. And when people were buried, they were buried along with weapons and trinkets and some food to take with them to whichever world they were going to. So this feeling of this mystery of death has been with us for a very long time. And perhaps that may have been the origin of religions, the longing and search for a way of looking at life in which the whole of life begins to have some meaning. But religion today, sadly, has completely lost meaning. All the religions, it has become an empty shell, just filled with rituals. And if you look elsewhere, forget religion, look at the rest of life. Industrialization and globalization are indifferent to the fate of individuals. They are just interested in profits. They're just interested in expansion and power. Power has become such an important factor in life. And so you begin to see why the statement that Thoreau made is not only true today, well, it was true even 150 years back, maybe many, many centuries. And see, there's a tremendous sorrow in this. Why we have created lives which lack meaning so utterly. So I finally come to this question: what will take away this emptiness? What will bring stability and solidity and integrity into our lives? What will bring light into our lives? Krishnaji said, be a light unto yourself. What is the source of inward richness? Is there a quality of inward richness which, if it were there, we would never feel the need for identifying with anything? Because that inward richness is a self-sustaining thing. It nourishes itself and it nourishes us. What is the source of that? Where does it come from? This question was asked by a child. I'm not sure whether it was in Rishi Valley or Rajghat, but sometime in the 50s or 60s, asked Krishnaji, why do we want to be famous? And he answers, if you are known all over the world, you feel very important. It gives you a sense of immortality. You want to be famous. You want to be known and talked about in the world, because inside yourself, you're nobody. Look at that phrase, inside yourself, you're nobody. Inwardly, there is no richness. There is nothing there at all. Therefore, you want to be known in the world outside. But if you're inwardly rich, then it does not matter to you whether you are known or unknown. To be inwardly rich is much more arduous than to be outwardly rich and famous. It needs much more care, much closer attention. If you have a little talent and know how to exploit it, you become famous. Well, we see that happening all over the world. If you have a little talent, you become famous. But inward richness does not come about in that way. To be inwardly rich, the mind has to understand and put away the things that are not important, like wanting to be famous. Inward richness implies standing alone. So what are the key things? This statement again is a very, very key paragraph. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to put away the things that are not important? Which means we need to understand what is not important, what is important and what is not important. And why do we give so much importance to things which deep down perhaps have no importance at all? We cling to those things as though, it's like you possess some wonderful looking car and we give great value to that car. But it's just there, you identify with something of that kind. So what is inward richness? What get an understanding, a handle on this mysterious thing called inward richness? So I've asked out here now, is it possible to live without identification? This question is absolutely unavoidable if we want to see any hope for the future, for future not just of our country but of the world. Can one live without identification? In contrast with the aggressive self-righteous demand for identity. Just look at, you have the unspoken anonymity of nature. You just look at sometimes a bird feeding its young, completely occupied with living. It's not bothered with whether someone is observing it or not observing it. In fact, it would rather not be noticed at all. It doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be noticed by anybody. The flower growing in the ditch, as you pass by, we observe only the conspicuous things around us, but we don't see the flower, perhaps one tiny little flower growing in the ditch, unnoticed, not asking to be noticed. Or a butterfly flitting from flower to flower, not asking to be seen. So this question to me is unavoidable. Can one bring about that quality of anonymity in us, that quality where we don't ask to be noticed, don't ask to be, somebody to notice the difference between us and other people? How is such a quality going to come about? In this book, Think on These Things, Krishnaji uses a very beautiful phrase called the confidence of innocence. And he says, he uses it. So I have asked out here, based on that, can there be a basis to living which is not belief, not identifying with something, not the building of psychological walls, not the endless quest to become something bigger than what we are? This whole business of caught in ambition, in achieving something, aspiring towards something. Can there be a basis to living which is not that? Can there be the beauty and simplicity of anonymity? Can there be the confidence of innocence? It's a very beautiful phrase, a combination of words that Krishnaji has used out here. He points out that we normally use the word confidence only as self-confidence. I am confident of my abilities. Because I am very good at something, I am confident, I strut about and I feel superior to other people, right? That's the general connotation of the word confidence. But is there a kind of confidence which can come about which is not related to your own capacities at all? And he calls it the confidence of innocence, where you're in a state of listening, of learning, and there is no element of the known coming in. We have probably not glimpsed for ourselves how strong vulnerability can be. We think that vulnerability is weak and will die, and therefore it will just perish instantly when you touch it, and it cannot withstand any force on it. But probably we have not understood for ourselves how strong it is, a quality it is. Here's a quote from Hermann Hesse, writing about trees, which perhaps are the most beautiful form of creation. He says, a tree says, my strength is trust. I know nothing about my fathers. I know nothing about the 1,000 children that every year spring out of me. I live out the secret of my seed to the very end, and I care for nothing else. I trust that my labor is holy. Out of this trust, I live. So, I've quoted out here a phrase, a Sanskrit chant, which we all have in our schools. Asato ma sadgamaya. Now just look at the first line of that piece. Asato ma sad. It normally would be translated as, lead me from truth, from untruth to the truth, from falsity to truth, right? But it can also be understood in a different way. Can lead me from the unreal to the real. Can we learn to turn our backs to that which is not real? And at its very root, the act of identification is you're doing something unreal. It's a fictional reality, and we don't understand the deadliness of that fictional reality. Is it possible for us to turn our backs to this fiction that we have built for ourselves? Here's a quote from Krishnaji. I'm almost at the end of my presentation. Thought is the mischief maker. All the images it has created in the churches, in the temples, in the mosques are not truth, are not actual. They have been invented by us and by the priests out of our fear, out of our anxiety and uncertainty of the future. We have created a symbol and we are caught in it. So first realize that thought will always create the things which give satisfaction psychologically, which give comfort. The reassuring image is a great comfort. It may be a total illusion, and it is, but it gives comfort, and therefore we will never look beyond the illusion. So this is where I've reached the end now, and I just asked a couple of questions here. What is going to allow us or help us to turn our backs to this fiction that we have so carefully cultivated for ourselves? You know, Krishnaji said, when you are a light to yourself, you are a light to the world, because the world is you and you are the world. And now it may seem that this talks about something which is so far beyond us, like enlightenment and all, but I don't think so. I think if we start to see when something is untrue, when something is false, we turn our backs to it, we drop it. And I think we have to take those small steps, and perhaps those small steps are the soil in which inward richness really grows. It's not something which we can, it's not something in our hands. It grows on its own, but its basis is perhaps when we live truth. So can we take responsibility? Can we learn what it means to care? Perhaps then integrity and stability will come on their own. And perhaps then we will understand what inward richness is and what it means to be a light to oneself. So let me close with one very beautiful short piece by Krishnaji. The tree is nothing to itself. It exists. And it's in its very existence, it is the most beautiful thing. You see, a lily or a rose never pretends, and its beauty is that it is what it is. So this is the question I would pose to all of us. What is the source of inward richness? What makes it come about? And what will it take for us to see that this seeking, this constant seeking of identity, seeking of identification is something false? What will it take for us to actually see that there's something false, and from that falsity, an enormous amount of deadliness and violence spring? What will it take for us to see that? So let me stop here and invite questions and responses. Gurvinder, how shall we take it forward?
Yeah, so I can pose some questions which have been posed in the chat.
Oh, they already have? Yeah, please go ahead. You choose which one.
Yeah. So the first question is what I came up with, which is that we see that this need for, say, identity as Indian or Hindu comes as a reaction to, say, Islamic identity. So they are mutually reinforcing, and that gives the fuel to this is constant reinforcement from the other, because my identity is coming from a reaction to what I see, what the other person is doing. So in this, the identification keeps growing, and it ultimately, as you pointed out, leads to violence. There's no, because we have seen that in the past and we are seeing it now.
Yeah.
So the whole question is, how do we break that chain? How do we break? Is it at an individual level, or is there also a collective action?
Well, collective action becomes things like going through the law, concerning ourselves with whether we are a secular country, whether we are not. All those kinds of solutions start coming up. And I think we get completely caught in that if you look at the kind of conversations going on in the country. I don't see any solution apart from education in which we bring up people from the very earliest time to live original lives where they are actually in contact with the earth, with themselves, with their own emotions. You see, the whole problem is that this thing assumes so much importance because, as Krishnaji has said, we have become second-hand people. So identity has become dreadfully important for all. It's not just Hindu identity or Muslim identity. Both, all identities are of the same nature. So we have to, that to me is the primary action that is needed, that we have to bring up children who have a certain stability and solidity inwardly, which can only come about when we have given the space for their inner nature to develop, their ability to ask questions, their ability to inquire. I mean, it's a vast question. It opens up the whole field of education, because otherwise we are just going to get caught up in this, in trying to, solutions of diplomacy, agreements, peace agreements, this agreement, that agreement, which are constantly being broken. It's like those peace agreements in the Middle East. Every day they make an agreement and then somebody breaks it. There is no solution to it. To me, it seems, unless we are prepared to see the false as the false, as Krishnaji has said so often. When we see something as false, we have to be prepared to drop it and not find half solutions based on that. In some ways, there is no answer to the question that you have put, because for example, if you move to, let's say, a situation like the war in Ukraine, what is the answer to that? There is actually no answer. When there's a very strong assertion of national identity, it's going to cause violence. And the answer cannot be that you assert your identity with equal force and resist that violence. I don't know. That's one kind of an answer which people may want, but it's going to only breed still more violence, which may come at some future point in time, not immediately. In this particular case, one particular person, one particular group may be seen as the villain. I'm now referring to the war in Europe. But we don't see that the real cause of what is happening in Europe is not the madness or the lunatic actions of one particular person. It's the whole nature of nationalism itself. It's the whole business of making nations, and one nation versus another. And in that sense, the whole thinking of man, in which we have divided ourselves into nations and created nationalistic identity, that itself is the culprit. That's the true culprit of this war. And it's not just one person suddenly going berserk and wanting to destroy everybody else. He looks like the immediate culprit, but we have to dig deeper and understand the actual problem, which is that the insistence that we give to nationalism, to having a national identity. We have made this this idea that for democracy to function, we have to have a national identity. We have to question this thing. Why are we not able to function as a democracy? So now, coming back to your question, we have to ask why, can't we, why is it that we are not able to live together? So anyway, I won't say for this, one can go on in this vein, but to me, a solution is not going to be found in this whole mode of action reaction.
Right. Okay, so the next question is, um, does not our compulsive need for identity stem from need to be seen in a particular manner by others? In other words, the search for identity presupposes the existence of the other.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a division, as you had pointed out, that is created. So I think this question is alluding to that.
Yes, that is. You see, of course, it is so, right? That we from the early years, we are brought up to have this. We are praised for certain things that we do, criticized for certain other things that we do. So we create a kind of persona within us that is that always builds itself in opposition to what is around us. That you have to stand out from those who are around you. You are separated in some way through the process of reward and punishment. So if you look at the actual origin of it in our education system or in the way children are brought up in families, I think the source, the problem seems to lie there, that from the very early years, this separation is being brought about through our communication to a child. And why a little child growing up, what does religious identity mean to that person? Just think of it. You know, if he is happily playing, he's playing, learning about the earth, about plants, about things around, just playing with his friends. Where does this question of religious identity even matter? It begins to matter when, as you start growing up, you find that your life lacks a basis completely. You've been brought up in such a way that you are nothing inside. You depend. You are acknowledged only if you have that identity. So unless we understand that phenomenon of why we all give so much importance to it, we are going to be confronted with the secondary question of what to do with these identities. Of now that these identities have been created, what are we going to do with them? But to me, it seems that there is no answer to that question, because by trying to answer that question, we are only caught in some action reaction. So we have to start from the very beginning.
Right. So
Guruvinder, you please feel free. You should also, whatever you can also comment on what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next time, yes.
Yeah.
So the next question is, how does a symbol give vitality?
How does a symbol? That's a very interesting question. Why does a symbol give? Probably it gives us strength, because the symbol it's an unmoving thing. It's a something on which you can depend. Like there's a certain. It's never going to go away. It's always there within your grasp. You can hold it. It doesn't let you down. It's very faithful in that sense, and it helps. If you also believe in the same symbol and I believe in it, it brings us together. We reinforce us, that we whip those feelings in each other. So the vitality it brings about a certain energy, which I think Krishnaji sometimes calls it the energy of friction. Because when we are both together, we whip each other up, and say, for example, we chant together in a religious house. Or in a war situation, you can imagine soldiers screaming together and sort of whipping each other, and that sort of whipping each other into a frenzy. So that there's a certain power and energy which belief in a symbol, belief in something solid, in unmoving, brings about. It does it because there are other people involved. It's a dynamic process. And there's a feedback happening that both of us are believing in this. We are friends, we are comrades. The others are our enemy. We will always defend each other. So you see, a certain emotionality which is built up, and it gives you a certain vitality of life. That's again drawing from history. That's how it has operated.
And also to me, it seems that having a symbol gives a sense of seeking permanence, because let's say I'm a monk and I'm wearing a robe, and if I touch that robe, that gives me some vitality that I'm not supposed to have desire. So it's a reminder, and it's permanent, whereas my mind is all the time changing. So I need something permanent to hold on to. So now the next question is.
Can I just make a comment here?
Yes, Sushma. Yeah.
See, somewhere actually we can deny all the religions, we can deny all the things, but I think every religion has been created with its own culture. Can we completely throw away the culture also? It is like throwing, just like Asatoma Sadgame. This is such a beautiful chant. It doesn't belong to, in one sense, any religion. But now it is associated with so-called Hinduism. But can we throw away the baby also with the bathwater? That is one thing. Then the symbol actually represents something to you, something to Govinda. But actually, in my mind, the symbol represents something in each and every stone also, that the area of unknown is there. The area of something beyond is there. And so that becomes a symbol for me. Like this, the symbol becomes a symbol like you are in the area of known all the time. And what is this unknown, and which that is represented by this idol? And that, if that is in my mind, I look at that symbol in that perspective. So is it not that we are trying to throw away, in the name of throwing away all the religions, throwing away all the things, and including then, see, Krishnamurti schools now. Krishnamurti schools have become another symbol actually, in that sense, to represent Krishnamurti. But so can we just throw away the whole culture which got created because of maybe many people have explored into something? Over.
No, I don't think we should. Yes, you're right. If the symbol starts to become a problem when it starts to take the place of the real, when it starts to replace what we actually see of life, when we give more importance to a symbolic representation which represents something, which is supposed to represent something, than to the thing itself. It is true that everything around us that we have done is actually symbolic. It is symbolic of something. But our repeated insistence on it has made us stuck to the symbol, and we have lost connection with whatever is deeper. So that's where the difficulty lies. So that means we get separated from actual living nature of life, the current of life, thing which is actually living. So I think that it has to come the other way around. We shouldn't be throwing as you said, the baby with the bathwater. But everything that is beautiful about a particular culture can be there if one comes to it from the other direction. Not that you cling to a symbol, you cling to a culture, cling to certain traditions, but you are in contact with life itself. You are actually seeing things which are true. You have turned away from the false, and then you can do all these things. Then they are no longer symbols to which you cling. You can then have all these things. You can have You can have beautiful dance form, you can have beautiful music. Everything is possible if the source is different. But when it becomes a replacement for the real, that's where the difficulty lies. I think, which is why it comes back to education again and again. You can't answer this question from the top end. You have to start from the other end.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. No, somewhere actually I was also thinking that we can't throw away the baby with the bathwater. That is true. So the culture which is deep rooted in every place. I'm not saying only in India, but it is in India, it is in Europe, it is in every place has its own culture, and which is extremely beautiful. And maybe when you are born in that soil, it nurtures, that culture also nurtures you. I think that has a very nurturing feeling. So I think we just can't throw away anything blindly, but can we start from the other end? That is the very important thing which you are saying. That is one. And second, suppose I'm nurtured with certain culture, but I don't want to impose that culture on another human being. That is also a very beautiful part of it, the important part of it. Over.
Okay, so the next the next question is, or it's not a question actually, it's a statement. To be aware of inward poverty, insecurity as it shows itself moment to moment in our daily life, to be honest about it and never escape from it by pursuing outer riches. Will this open the doors to inward richness?
That's something which we have to explore find out through our own exploration, I think. I don't think it can be answered like that. But if we want to live a life of honesty, definitely that's what we have to do. That is, we have to learn what it means to turn our backs to the false without any feeling of any promise being made by anybody. You see, there's no promise in this. It's not that we do it and we are doing it with the promise that if we do it, we will get that. It cannot be done like that. If something is false, we have to have the courage, you can say, or the clarity to turn our backs to falsity, to something false that we've been doing, without any sense of hope that there is something some beautiful thing which is in wait for us because we do that. Otherwise, we can still be fooling ourselves. We may turn our backs to one kind of falsity and get caught in another kind, which is the problem of becoming something. So it cannot be done out of a sense of expectation. But we have to see that, to actually see something as false, and then once you see it as false, it is out, eliminated from our lives completely, and live out of that clarity of mind, which we have now shed some baggage. We have simplified, become lighter beings, you can say, and relationship perhaps will assume a different dimension. Our relationship with plants and animals and the earth may have a different quality. Inward richness is not something which is in our hands. It's something like something which will grow in that soil. We don't know what it is. We cannot dictate what it is.
Right. The next question is, could you kindly elaborate on what does it mean to stand alone? Because the versus identification, because we know that identification process is going on in us. So what does it mean to stand alone?
I would say again, it is related to that previous point, that if we see that by so-called identification, we imagine that we are related to people. So for example, you believe in something and I say, and I also decide I'm going to believe in that, subscribe to that, and therefore we become related. I think it creates an illusion of relationship between us, that we both subscribe to the same ideology and therefore we are together. Actually, we are not together. We are together in a rather illusory kind of way. And I think we have to experiment with what happens to relationship with human beings when we step out of that, when we decide not to carry on that process in that manner. What will happen to us? I think it will change the way that we look at people, the way we listen to people, the way we treat people when we are not. Of course, it's not the only thing. I mean, there are many other elements which we have to look into also. This is one very important aspect, is standing alone. We also have to examine the question of power, question of, how we are, the images that we carry about people, our prejudices and so on. There are many other factors which we have to look into. But standing alone can happen only when we when we are out of that falsity. I think we will learn the meaning of relationship only if we actually do that. We can't, we won't know the meaning of it till we actually do it. The point is that if we don't do it, we are living under illusion. We think we are related, but it is not so. And this point perhaps is difficult to understand. This whole notion of we, we believe together in something, therefore it's a we. But is there really a we? It's really a widespread belief among human beings, in every country, that if we all believe in some symbol together, then there is a we. We are collectively true. We become collectively strong, and we can invade another country or whatever. But there's something rather, it's something a bit insane about it also. I think standing alone means not carrying images, not carrying prejudices, being able to see things as they are, being aware of what's happening inside me. I think standing alone also is just sometimes, like inward richness, is not something which we can readily say what it is. We have to begin to learn what it is by putting away the things which we have been doing, which are false.
Right. And if I may add, we have to also look at the various influences about us from childhood and even now. We get influenced by so much of political commentary and echo chambers.
Absolutely,
that
yes.
we live in. So the next question is around this question of emptiness. I'll read the long question, but
yeah.
The identification is mechanism that is used to deal with inner insecurity and emptiness, as was shared. Unless we understand the root behind this need, we will develop another mechanism, if not identification with beliefs and ideas. So how does one go about investigating that basic need for being and security? So in other words, how do we deal with this inner emptiness? So is there any clue that you can give us?
How does one deal with inner emptiness? Okay, that feeling which Thoreau communicated when he says, the mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. I think that probably the first action is to admit that to ourselves and not imagine that we are living in some fanciful idea of life, fanciful idea of ourselves. We have to understand what we are actually doing and turn our backs to it. decide not to do things which are false. Inner poverty, I think, comes about because we listen so much to the words of other people, whether it is the media, whether it is advertisements, whether it is the words of some expert or some religious leader. We are so filled with conclusions of others, and after a while we start to believe that they are our own words. But deep down, perhaps we are aware that they are not our own words, they are not our own observations, which means that there is a kind of hollowness inside us. And we never give an opportunity for that inner growth. So I would like to focus on this question for a little while. What is going to help that inner growth to happen? And I think the only thing is when we understand the great importance of seeing things with our own eyes and actually being aware of what we are doing, which is why I think Krishnaji gave so much importance to what he called the art of listening, the art of seeing, and the art of learning. And he didn't distinguish between these. You know, they were all sort of in one flow. He would talk about all of them. The art of listening being to actually listen to somebody wholly, without any element of your own interpretation, your own commentary, your own criticism. And the art of seeing, to be able to see something actually as it is, without the color of somebody else's observation, some past. That observation could be our own observation also from some past. So now what will happen when we begin to live this way? When we actually are living that way, then we are not living second-hand lives. We are living, it becomes first-hand then. And I think it's that first-hand contact with life which is essential for inward growth to happen. Inward richness, I think, can happen only if we are actually in contact with life in that deep sense, where we are really observing and in contact with what is actually happening, without being without that layer of prejudice, that layer of past ideas, past opinions. When you're really in contact with somebody, I think, and I think another component of this which we have not perhaps focused enough on is also being aware of what's happening inside us. Perhaps that is much more complex. It's not just listening and seeing others. It's also being aware of our own, what's happening inside us. And perhaps that creates its own soil in which growth happens. When we are so deeply aware of ourselves, aware of our own currents, I think a certain kind of a growth can happen, which is not growth in the ordinary sense of that word. It's not maybe the word growth is not the best one. There's no proper word I can think of, in fact. It's some kind of an inner movement which happens, which is based on on having seen things as they actually are. So inward richness, I think, it's something to be explored. I'm not sure I will be able to say much more. It's a matter of exploration for me also. It's not that I am, it's a question for me. I'm also exploring it.
Yeah, and much of this exploration can happen in silence.
Yeah.
When you're really watching, then there is this because exploration is not just having a conversation or talking about it. It can happen from moment to moment when you're really in silence, then you can see what is arising.
So just 1 minute, Gurvinder. So just going back to your question, I just spotted the question which you read out. So it's written out here. Unless we understand the root behind this need, we will develop another mechanism. Quite right. If the basic problem is that sense of inner loneliness or emptiness, well, instead of identifying with somebody, you could run off into excitement, fill your life with tremendous amount of activity and noise and sensation. So quite right. It's you will. There's a word which Krishnaji often used to use in his earlier years. He said substitution. So we get caught in substitution. We put away one kind of activity, which may be identification, and substitute it with something else, which may be excitement or activity. But they are all the root is the same in all these cases. So you begin to see that identity is not the primary problem which we have to focus on, but the problem is that of this emptiness within us, which we are trying to escape all the time, and which the tackling of it can happen only by becoming very closely, deeply aware of ourselves and not running away from ourselves. So that's how we come back to education again and again. Yes, sorry, I interrupted you. Go on, please.
Yeah, the next question is that it seems to me that this process of identification that we see happening currently in our country and other places is somewhat camouflaged with this whole notion of development. For example, if I look at China, people have accepted this identification with a nation and not questioning communism at all, because they feel that economically they will progress and there will be development in the country, and they have been able to do it. And now it seems to have become a model for India also, that if you have a national identity, then you can also have development. So I think how do you look at this?
Well, that is a question which it needs some time to really go into it, because it's not just that particular context. You can also say, for example, there are countries in which reward and punishment is given tremendous importance, because it promotes a great deal of activity. It brings about excellence, they feel, right? For example, you have a space race between United States and the former Soviet Union, and they produced great space missions and they went all over the place. Or so many developments which took place as a result of that competitive urge and this urge to dominate. So, and it's not at all a coincidence that so many of the inventions that we have today in our world derive one way or the other from warfare. Second World War, for example, was the source of so many important inventions and discoveries. So the energy, there's no question at all that the energy of friction is significant, and a lot can happen when there is the energy of friction. So when we all gang up together and say we are a nation, now we should hold together and we should become better than the next nation and completely dominate it, and we whip ourselves into feeling that way, we probably will do it also. We will probably develop our economy, our products, our industry, maybe our cities will be cleaner, our country will be cleaner. But we have to understand it in a much longer scale, much longer time scale. In the immediate moment, we may achieve whatever we say we are achieving. We have achieved development and scientific progress and greater economic levels and so on. But we have to see that this idea is fundamentally one which generates conflict. And if it generates conflict, at some, it may be, it displaced in time and space. It may not happen immediately. It's something which we have to see, that we have to look at the world as a whole, not just one country as just its own development. Its own development may happen. Excellent example is so many of the Western countries which had terrific economic development, and unknown to their own citizens, they parcel off their garbage to third world countries. They just dump it, send it on ships and dump it on Malaysia and India and whatever, look at the the attitude that is being conveyed by this. So we may not be aware of the hidden consequences of what is happening. At superficial level, yes, there seems to be many good things which are happening, but I'm afraid there are consequences which we may not be aware of, which could be consequences to the environment. China, for example, is destroying its environment by its production. And for that matter, India is probably too. So this desire for dominating and dominating other countries, it may result in a certain kind of benefit, but that's looking at it in a very small, narrow space. We don't realize the cost at a wider level, what is happening.
Right. So you said you had some video of Krishnamurti. How long is it?
It's exactly 12 minutes. Shall I play it now and then we can stop at 12 o'clock?
Yeah, that'll be great.
Okay, good. I'll play it without the subtitles, okay? Because subtitles are very bad. They are too full of mistakes.
Okay.
So look at the basic thing out here. What should be done to help India and its people? I'll mute my mic now.
Tell us, sir, what should be done seriously to help the country and the countrymen. For no philosophy, nor books, nor talks can solve this problem. Tell us seriously what should be done to help the country and the people of the country. For no philosophy, no books, no talks can solve these problems. Are you quite sure that no philosophy, no leader, no book, Gita, Upanishad, Brahma Sutra, no book, no philosophy, no leader will help this country or yourself? Are you quite sure of that? You understand my question? Or is it just a rhetorical question? If you are serious and you say none of these will help, and you have clear about it, that no book, no leader, no outside agency, nobody can help you, right? To bring about a transformation, a change, radical change in the structure of this country. Moral, ethical, aesthetic, social. Are you quite sure when you put that question that they cannot? Or you're just playing with words? If you are quite sure that nobody can help you, then what will you do? You know the country is corrupt. You cannot rely on any politician. The people who write books about something, beyond the mind or in the mind or something or other, they don't know what they're talking about. Right? Right? So what will you do? Come on, sirs. What will you do? Huh? We have looked at the problem. Who is not? I am just, please, madam, we are looking at the problem. The problem is overpopulation, the division in class, the lack of right education, tradition, and we have so depended on others, right? Books, leaders, one after the other you have had, right? And they haven't, the country, the people have not changed. So what will you do? What will you do, sir, when you realize this? People? Are you accepting responsibility? Are you accepting the responsibility? Are you accepting the responsibility for yourself to see that you behave properly? Or is it again that's just talk? So do you know what is happening to this country? Do you all realize? I've been coming to this, speaker has been coming to this country every winter for the last 60 years. You have advanced technologically. You are as clever, as inventive as anybody else. And you, as a human being, are slowly dying. You have the culture that this country has had gone, finished, torn apart. Right? Everyone is living for himself. He's not concerned about his son's future, his grandson's future. You're not concerned of your neighbor. You follow? You're not concerned at all about others except about yourself. The country is breaking up. Tamil Nadu, Telugu Nadu, whatever Nadus you have. This country is breaking up. The family is breaking up. And there is no new flame. You are just repeating. When you repeat, there is certain dead security. And that's, you are in that state now. What are we going to do? What are you all going to do, sirs? Education, you know what it is in this country. It is the lowest. Professors who have been from abroad, teachers from abroad have told me. They come here to investigate. Says there is no education at all, just bookwork, learning, memorizing. You understand? So education is at its lowest ebb. There is violence hidden. It may explode at any time. There's all the preparation for war. So the country is facing a tremendous crisis. Your country, the land on which you are living, and you don't seem to care. And you build temples, huh? Go to the temples, take vows, you follow. Professionally, you're a lawyer or an engineer, and go to a temple with all the superstitions. You follow the contradiction. God's sake, realize what's happening. So what will you do? Or will you do nothing as you are, what is happening now? Do nothing. Let go down the drain. You look at me, don't look at me, sirs. Let's not look at the land that you are despoiling, the beauty of the country. Will you undertake the responsibility, not verbally, but actually to be responsible for what you are, what you do, what you think, how to behave honestly, with integrity? Not be, so you know what, will you? That's the only thing that's going to change this country. If there are a group of people who are really concerned with the future of this country. Because the politicians are not, the gurus are not. What's going to happen to your grandchildren? So if you seriously undertake that you will be totally responsible for yourself, that you will be generous, you will not be corrupt. You may lose your job, starve, die, you follow, sir, hold to something. Then you will probably help the country to become something totally different as it is. It's a beautiful country. Vast space, marvelous rivers and trees and mountains. Somebody said the other day, it's a lovely country except for the Indians. Yes, sir, face it.
All right, so we are towards the end of today's presentation and question and answer and video. So thanks for introducing the theme for us and giving us many questions. I think we have many questions today to ponder over, reflect on. And one of the reasons we have is invited speaker is to give a new quality of freshness to our inquiry. So maybe we'll take up some questions that you have given us and pursue that in our future meetings among ourselves. So thank you for accepting to come and give your valuable time to this talk. and we'll have more opportunities to listen to you in the next academic year.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with all of you. So, goodbye. All the best.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Shailesh. Thank you.
Goodbye, Sushma. Thank you.